Girls in my community had their vocal cords cut to keep our voices soft for future husbands, so I faked a pregnancy to avoid my appointment. When my parents found out, they pinned me down and scheduled a triple cut for the next morning that would leave me completely mute. Girls in my community had their vocal cords partially severed at 13 to ensure our voices remained pleasingly soft for our future husbands. The procedure happened in this little straw hut with tools that were never cleaned and was carried out with no anesthetic. My appointment was scheduled 2 weeks after my 14th birthday, and I knew what I was in for after I watched my older sister go through what she did. My parents threw her a celebration dinner the night she had her throat cut. She sat at the table trying to thank them, but only air came out. Blood had soaked through the white gauze wrapped around her throat and dripped onto her dinner plate while she struggled to swallow soup. When I asked, did it hurt? Her face went pale and she tried to scream while nodding, but no sound came out, just this horrible wheezing sound as her body shook. 3 weeks after her surgery, she woke up choking on her own blood. The poorly done paper stitches had torn in her sleep. She tried to scream for help but only gurgled and aspirated more blood into her lungs. I found her turning blue on her bedroom floor, clawing at her throat. My parents drove her to the same hut she had her procedure, where she had to write "can't breathe" over and over. The doctor finally restitched her throat, during which my sister kept going red and crying from the pain, and she slept sitting up for months afterward, terrified of drowning in her own blood again. The worst part was when 3 classmates cornered her in the equipment room, knowing she couldn't scream. She came out 20 minutes later with bruises and torn clothes, but no one believed her frantic written account, not even our parents. She ended up taking her own life 8 months after her procedure. She left a note saying she felt like she was buried alive in her own body. At the funeral, my mother gave this speech about how my sister was too sensitive and should have embraced her feminine silence like the other girls. All the cut women stood there nodding in agreement, their husbands' hands on their shoulders like they were holding down ghosts. I stood in the back row wondering when my own appointment would be. And now, it was here. 1 week before it happened, we were having a family BBQ when I spotted my only potential escape, Rashad. He was back from college and the son of a good family friend. He was 19, but had been eyeing me ever since I started maturing. I waited until he'd had 3 beers, then went up to him and started brushing his arm and talking to him like he was the man of my dreams. We ended up leaving for his place where we slept together. It was my first time, far from magical like I thought it would be. I felt disgusting and humiliated afterwards, but it had to be done. 2 days later, I took a pregnancy test and showed it to my mother. Rashad had worn a rubber, but the 2 lines still showed up because I'd stolen the test from one of the girls in school who used the same trick. Once my mother saw that I was pregnant, her face lit up. She called an emergency family meeting that night where everyone agreed Rashad, who was too hammered to remember he wore a rubber, would be an amazing father and that my vocal surgery would have to wait until after the baby. I remember celebrating on the inside. My plan was working, and this was only phase 1. You see, my fake morning sickness gave me freedom to leave the house for prenatal appointments that were really meetings with my cut classmates. I recorded testimonies on my phone and hid them in deep folders. The cut girls wrote what they wished they could say, while uncut girls described waiting for their turn. I knew I only had a few weeks before my parents would get suspicious about the baby, so I had to move fast. And that's why everything fell apart. I was careless and left the house in the evening when I knew my mother was also out somewhere. And because the universe is twisted, she caught me with the other girls. I didn't know it then, but when I came home, I sure as hell found out. The first thing my dad did was pin me down onto the kitchen floor. I tried protesting and asking what was going on, and that's when my mother started pressing and stomping on my bladder until I wet myself. She used that to get the results of another pregnancy test. Of course, this one came back negative, and my parents absolutely freaked out. They sat me down on the couch, pulled out my phone, started going through it, and called Rashad's parents. I ended up bruised quite heavily, and that night there was another emergency meeting, this time about how I had deceived everyone and how poor Rashad thought he was becoming a father. They made me apologize to him. At the very end of the meeting, my dad decided he was done with me. He got Rashad and his parents out of the house before pinning me against the wall and telling me, "If you want to talk to everyone so much, let's see how you talk now." With that, he pulled out his phone and called the doctor. After a long minute of silence, he said thank you and hung up. "Your surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. We're doing a triple cut just for you. It hurts much worse, and you'll never talk again, not even a whisper. So you'll have plenty of time to think about how sorry you are for this little stunt." He then dropped me to the floor and walked away. I spent that night on the floor of my bedroom, my parents having locked me in from the outside. Every time I tried to move, pain shot through my ribs where my father had grabbed me. The house was silent except for the occasional footsteps outside my door, checking I was still there. Around midnight, I heard scratching at my window. My heart jumped, thinking maybe one of the cut girls had come to help, but when I crawled over and peeked through the curtains, I saw my father had nailed boards across the outside. The scratching was just a tree branch in the wind. I pulled out my phone, grateful they hadn't thought to take it, but when I tried to access my recordings, everything was gone. They must have deleted them while going through it. Months of testimonies, all those girls trusting me with their stories, erased in seconds. The bedroom door rattled. I froze as my mother's voice came through. She was talking to someone about tomorrow's procedure, confirming the time and asking about the recovery period for a triple cut. The other voice was too muffled to make out, but my mother's responses painted a clear picture. No solid food for 2 weeks. Constant supervision required. Risk of severe bleeding. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear more. My mother mentioned something about restraints, about how I might fight during the procedure. The other person must have suggested sedation, because my mother responded that they couldn't risk it with the triple cut, that I needed to be awake for them to gauge the depth correctly. After they left, I searched my room for anything useful. My parents had been thorough. No scissors, no sharp objects, even my nail file was gone. The window was sealed, the door locked from outside. I was trapped. I tried to sleep but kept thinking about my sister, how she'd looked that morning I found her, the way her fingers had clawed at her throat, the note she left behind, each word carefully printed because she could no longer speak them. I wondered if she'd felt this same terror the night before her procedure. Dawn came too quickly. I heard my parents moving around downstairs, the smell of breakfast drifting up. My stomach turned. Through my door, I could hear other voices arriving. Extended family, here to ensure I went through with it. The lock clicked. My father stood in the doorway with 2 of my uncles behind him. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. They grabbed my arms, hauling me to my feet. My mother appeared with clothes, the traditional white dress all girls wore to their cutting ceremony. I tried to pull away, but my uncle's grips were iron. They held me while my mother stripped off my pajamas and forced the dress over my head. It was my sister's dress, still faintly stained despite multiple washes. washings. My mother noticed me staring at the stains and smiled coldly. Downstairs, more family had gathered. Aunts, cousins, all watching as I was marched through the house. Some of the cut women wouldn't meet my eyes. Others nodded approvingly. My grandmother sat in her chair, her own throat bearing the thick scar from her childhood procedure. They'd brought zip ties. My father bound my wrists in front of me while my uncles held my shoulders. The plastic cut into my skin when I tested them. No one spoke to me directly, discussing my transport and the procedure timeline as if I wasn't there. Outside, 3 cars waited. They weren't taking any chances on me escaping during the drive. I was put in the middle vehicle with an uncle on each side. My parents took the lead car while other relatives followed behind. The drive to the hut took 20 minutes. I watched familiar streets pass by, knowing this might be the last time I'd see them as myself. Once the triple cut was done, once my voice was completely gone, I'd be someone else, something else. We passed the school where I'd collected testimonies. Some of my classmates were walking to morning lessons, their voices carrying on the wind. A few cut girls moved silently among them, shadows of who they used to be. One looked up as our convoy passed, her eyes widening when she saw me in the white dress. The hut appeared through the trees, exactly as I remembered from bringing my sister here. Same thatched roof, same rough wooden door. Smoke rose from a hole in the roof where they sterilized the cutting tools over open flame. My legs gave out when I saw it. My uncles dragged me the rest of the way, my feet scraping in the dirt. Inside, the doctor was already waiting. He was an old man with steady hands and cold eyes, the same one who'd cut my sister, my mother, my grandmother. The table was ready. Leather straps hung from its sides, worn smooth from years of use. The cutting tools lay on a cloth nearby, their edges gleaming. I could see the 3 different blades he'd use for the triple cut, each one designed to sever different parts of the vocal cords. My uncles lifted me onto the table. I thrashed, but they were too strong. The leather straps went around my arms, my legs, my waist. A final strap went across my forehead, holding it back to expose my throat. I could only move my eyes now. The doctor approached with the first blade. No greeting, no words of comfort. This was just another procedure to him, another girl to silence. He pressed fingers against my throat, feeling for the right spot. That's when we heard the commotion outside. Voices raised in argument, car doors slamming. My father went to check, irritation clear on his face. Through the doorway, I could see several cars had arrived. Parents were getting out, and with them, their daughters. Cut girls, all wearing their school uniforms. One of the mothers was shouting at my father, waving papers in his face. More families kept arriving. Soon there were at least 15 cars crowding the small clearing. The cut girls stood together in a group, their silence more powerful than any words. My father tried to push past them, but the mothers blocked his way. They kept showing him papers, documents of some kind. I strained against the straps, trying to see better. The doctor had paused, blade still in hand, watching the scene outside. Then I saw her, Catherine, one of the first girls I'd interviewed. She was holding something, showing it to the other parents. A phone, my phone. But how? My parents had deleted everything. The arguing intensified. Some of the fathers were now involved, voices rising. My uncles left their posts to join the confrontation. Only my mother remained inside with the doctor and me, her face growing paler by the minute. Catherine's mother pushed through the crowd, heading straight for the hut. My mother tried to block the doorway, but more parents followed. Soon the small space was packed with bodies. The doctor stepped back, clearly unsure what was happening. Catherine held up the phone, and I heard my own voice playing from its speaker. The recordings. Somehow the recordings were playing. Not just my voice, but the testimonies. Girl after girl describing their procedures, their complications, their assaults. The cut girls in the crowd stood straighter with each word, their parents' faces changing from anger to horror. My mother lunged for the phone, but Catherine's mother caught her wrist. Other parents were pulling out their own phones now, recording the confrontation. The doctor tried to leave, but found his path blocked by fathers who suddenly seemed to see him differently. On the table, I could only watch as my months of work finally found its audience. Not in the way I'd planned, but here, at the very moment they'd tried to silence me forever. The recordings kept playing, testimony after testimony. Some parents were crying. Others were shouting at my father, at the doctor, at the tradition itself. Catherine's mother approached the table and began undoing my straps. My mother protested, but was held back by other women. As each strap came loose, I felt possibility returning. The head strap came off last, and I sat up, my throat untouched. The hut erupted into chaos. Parents were demanding answers from the doctor, who was backing toward the door. My father was shouting about tradition, about respect, about feminine virtue, but his words were drowned out by the testimonies still playing, by the voices of girls who'd found a way to speak despite their silence. I slid off the table on shaking legs. Catherine caught my arm, steadying me. She made a sign I didn't recognize, but her mother translated. She'd saved everything to cloud storage the day I'd shown her the recordings. When she saw our convoy passing the school, she'd known what was happening. The confrontation moved outside as more cars arrived. Word was spreading through the community. Parents who'd never questioned the tradition were hearing their daughters' stories for the first time. The cut girls stood together, no longer isolated in their silence. My father tried to grab me but found his path blocked by a wall of mothers. My own mother stood frozen, watching her perfect world crumble. The doctor had disappeared, his tools abandoned on the bloody table. As the sun climbed higher, the clearing around the hut filled with families. The recordings had finished playing, but the conversations continued. Parents apologizing to their daughters, cut girls signing frantically to each other, finally able to share their experiences openly. I stood in the center of it all, still wearing my sister's stained dress, throat intact. The triple cut blade lay forgotten in the dirt, its edge clean. Around me, voices rose not in anger now, but in determination. The tradition that had silenced generations was facing its own judgment, but I knew this was just the beginning. My father's eyes still burned with rage. The doctor was still out there, and there were other communities, other huts, other girls waiting for their appointments. The real fight was just starting. The crowd outside the hut grew larger as more families arrived. My father pushed through the mothers, blocking his path, his face red with fury. He grabbed my arm and yanked me toward our car, but Catherine's mother stepped between us. Other women formed a protective circle around me while their daughters watched from behind, some crying, others signing frantically to each other. My father's hand tightened on my wrist until I winced. He pulled harder, dragging me a few steps before 3 fathers from the crowd intervened. They spoke to him in low, urgent tones while gesturing at the abandoned hut. The doctor's tools still lay inside, and several parents had begun photographing them with their phones. Catherine approached with her mother and handed me a jacket to cover the white dress. Her fingers moved in quick signs that her mother translated. She explained that she'd uploaded the recordings to multiple cloud accounts the moment I'd shown them to her. When she saw our convoy that morning, she'd sent the files to every parent she could reach. My mother finally finally emerged from the hut, her perfect composure cracking. She walked straight to my father and whispered something that made his jaw clench. He released my wrist and turned to address the crowd, but found himself facing dozens of angry parents. Some held their cut daughters close, while others demanded explanations. The confrontation escalated when one father shoved mine backward. My uncles moved to defend him but found themselves outnumbered. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, with more cars arriving every few minutes. Someone had called other communities, spreading word of what was happening. I felt dizzy from the sudden shift. Just minutes ago, I'd been strapped to that table. Now I stood surrounded by people who'd finally heard the truth. But my father's expression told me this wasn't over. He retreated to his car with my mother and uncles, their eyes never leaving me. Catherine's mother offered to drive me somewhere safe, but I shook my head. Running would only delay the inevitable. My father would find me, and the punishment would be worse. Instead, I asked her to gather the other girls who'd shared their testimonies. We needed to plan our next move. The crowd began to disperse as parents took their daughters home. Some families argued in the parking area while others left in tense silence. The cut girls signed to each other before being led away, their eyes holding a new kind of hope. The hut stood empty, its door hanging open like a wound. Catherine and 5 other girls stayed behind with their mothers. We formed a small circle away from the remaining cars. The mothers listened as I explained how I'd gathered the testimonies and why I'd tried the fake pregnancy scheme. Their faces showed a mix of admiration and concern. One mother suggested going to the authorities, but others quickly shut down that idea. Our community handled its own problems. Outside interference would only make things worse. Another proposed confronting the village elders, but we all knew they supported the tradition. They'd been the ones to bring the doctor here decades ago. As we debated options, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. She demanded I come home immediately. My father was waiting. The other girls saw my face pale and moved closer, forming a protective huddle. Their mothers exchanged worried glances. Catherine's mother drove me home, insisting on coming inside. 3 other mothers followed in their cars. When we arrived, my father stood on the front porch with his arms crossed. His expression was calm, which frightened me more than his earlier rage. Inside, my extended family filled the living room. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, all watching as I entered with the mothers behind me. My father gestured to a chair in the center of the room. I sat down, feeling like I was on trial. My grandmother spoke first. She talked about tradition, about the importance of feminine virtue, about how the cutting had been practiced for generations. Her own scar seemed to pulse as she spoke. Other relatives nodded along, their faces stern. Then my father stood. He walked around my chair as he spoke about betrayal, about bringing shame to our family, about the chaos I'd caused. He mentioned my sister, how she'd been weak, how I was following her path, my hands clenched in my lap. Catherine's mother tried to interject, but my father silenced her with a look. This was a family matter. The other mothers shifted uncomfortably but didn't leave. Their presence was the only thing keeping me safe. My father announced that I had 2 choices: submit to the triple cut procedure tomorrow morning, or be cast out from the family entirely. No money, no home, no contact with any relatives. Complete exile from the only world I'd known. The room fell silent. I looked around at my relatives' faces. Some seemed conflicted, others resolute. My mother stared at the floor. My grandmother nodded approvingly at my father's ultimatum. The cut women in the room touched their throats unconsciously. Catherine's mother stepped forward and offered to take me in if I chose exile. The other mothers voiced similar offers. My father's face darkened at this interference. He reminded them that harboring an exiled child would mean their families would also face consequences. The meeting ended with no resolution. My father gave me until sunrise to decide. The mothers reluctantly left after making me promise to call if I needed help. I was escorted to my room and locked in again, this time with boards across the inside of the window too. I sat on my bed, weighing impossible options: submit to the cutting and lose my voice forever, or lose my family and everything I'd known. Either way, I'd become someone else. The house settled into uneasy quiet as relatives found places to sleep, ensuring I couldn't escape during the night. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft tapping on my wall. The rhythm was deliberate, like a code. I pressed my ear against the plaster and heard more tapping from the other side. Someone in the guest room was trying to communicate. I tapped back randomly, not knowing any codes. The pattern changed, becoming more insistent. Then I heard a whisper through the thin wall. My cousin Sadie, one of the few uncut girls in our extended family. She was 15 and scheduled for her procedure next month. Through careful whispers and tapping, Sadie revealed that several relatives were having doubts. The testimonies had shaken them. Her own mother had been crying in the bathroom. 2 aunts were arguing with their husbands in hushed tones. The family wasn't as united as my father believed. Sadie had overheard my uncles discussing plans to ensure I couldn't escape. They would take shifts watching my door. In the morning, they'd escort me either to the hut or to the edge of town, depending on my choice. There would be no chance for last-minute resistance. She also shared disturbing news. The doctor hadn't disappeared. He was staying with another family, waiting. My father had paid him extra to remain available. If I chose the cutting, it would happen whether the community supported it or not. We whispered until nearly dawn, when footsteps in the hallway sent us both into silence. I lay back down, pretending to sleep, but my mind raced. The testimonies had created cracks in our community's foundation, but change wouldn't come fast enough to save me. As gray light filtered through the boarded window, I heard movement throughout the house. Relatives waking, preparing for my decision. The smell of breakfast drifted under my door, but my stomach was too knotted to feel hungry. The lock clicked open. My father entered with 2 uncles. His face showed no emotion as he asked for my decision. I stood on shaking legs, still wearing the stained white dress. The moment stretched between us like a blade. I chose exile. My father nodded once, unsurprised. He turned to leave, but I spoke again. I had conditions. I wanted to pack my belongings. I wanted to say goodbye to my mother. I wanted to walk out the front door with dignity, not be thrown out like garbage. His jaw tightened, but he agreed. 1 hour to pack. Supervised, of course. My uncles would ensure I took only clothes and personal items. No family photos, no heirlooms, nothing that connected me to the bloodline I was abandoning. My mother came to my room as I packed. She stood in the doorway, watching me fold clothes into a bag. Her face was unreadable. When I finished, she approached and straightened my collar, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it and left. Downstairs, the entire extended family had gathered. They formed a gauntlet from the stairs to the front door. Some relatives averted their eyes as I passed. Others stared with disappointment or disgust. My grandmother spat at my feet. At the door, my father waited with an envelope. Inside was cash, enough for a bus ticket and a few nights in a cheap motel. After that, I was on my own. He made it clear that any relative who helped me would face the same exile. I took the envelope and walked out. The morning air was cool on my face. Behind me, me, I heard the door close and lock. Just like that, I was no longer part of the family that had defined my entire existence. But I wasn't alone. At the end of our driveway, Catherine waited with her mother and several other families. They'd been there all night, taking shifts, making sure my family didn't try to force me to the hut. Now they stood ready to help, despite my father's threats. Catherine's mother took my bag and led me to her car. Other parents surrounded us, creating a buffer between me and my former home. As we drove away, I looked back once. My father stood at the window watching. Our eyes met for a moment before he turned away. The next few days blurred together. Catherine's family gave me a room while we figured out next steps. Word of my exile spread quickly through the community. Some families supported my father's decision. Others questioned whether the tradition was worth destroying families. More girls came forward with their stories, not just from our community, but from neighboring ones where the practice also existed. The recordings had been shared widely, sparking conversations that had been suppressed for generations. Support groups formed in living rooms and kitchens. But there was backlash too. Traditional families closed ranks, scheduling procedures for their daughters earlier than planned. Some girls disappeared from school, returning days later with bandaged throats and dead eyes. The doctor found plenty of work despite the growing resistance. My father's influence extended beyond our immediate family. Businesses owned by relatives refused to serve families that had helped me. Children were pulled from schools where teachers had spoken against the cutting. The community began to fracture along invisible lines. Catherine and I spent hours planning our next move. The testimonies had started something, but we needed more than stories. We needed proof that even traditional families were questioning the practice. We needed to show that the cutting wasn't just harmful, but unnecessary. Late one evening, Sadie appeared at Catherine's house. She'd snuck out, risking her own exile to bring news. Several younger relatives wanted to resist their procedures, but didn't know how. The fake pregnancy trick was now known, making it useless. They needed new strategies. We developed a network of safe houses where girls could hide when their cutting dates approached. Parents sympathetic to our cause offered spare rooms and basements. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it bought time for families to reconsider. The first test came when Sadie's appointment arrived. Her parents woke to find her bed empty and a note explaining her decision. The family erupted in chaos. Search parties formed. My father led efforts to find her, knowing she was probably with supporters of mine. Sadie moved between 3 different houses over 2 weeks. Each time searchers got close, she relocated. The constant pressure wore on everyone involved. Some families withdrew their support, frightened by the intensity of the backlash. During this time, I received a message through Catherine. My mother wanted to meet, alone. The request felt like a trap, but something in the wording made me consider it. Catherine's mother volunteered to drive me, waiting nearby in case things went wrong. We met at a small park outside town. My mother looked older, worn down by the conflict tearing through our community. She sat on a bench, hands folded in her lap. When she saw me, her composure cracked slightly. She spoke about my sister, details I'd never heard, how she'd begged to postpone her cutting, how she'd tried to run the night before, how my parents had dismissed her fears as childish anxiety. My mother's voice broke as she admitted wondering if things could have been different. Then she revealed why she'd really come. My grandmother was dying. The family matriarch who'd upheld every tradition, who'd spit at me during my exile, wanted to see me. The request made no sense, but my mother insisted it was genuine. I refused initially. My grandmother had shown me nothing but contempt, but my mother persisted, revealing that my grandmother had been asking about the testimonies. She'd been listening to the stories of cut girls, including some from her own generation. The meeting would have to be secret. My father couldn't know. We arranged for 3 nights later, when he'd be traveling to meet with other traditional family leaders. My mother would signal when it was safe to enter the house. Those 3 days passed slowly. Sadie remained hidden while search efforts intensified. 2 other girls joined our underground network, fleeing their own appointments. Resources stretched thin as more families faced the reality of the choice. The night arrived. Catherine's mother drove me to my old neighborhood, parking several blocks away. I walked through familiar streets, hood pulled up, feeling like a ghost haunting my former life. My mother's signal came, a porch light flicking twice. Inside, the house felt different, smaller somehow. My mother led me upstairs to my grandmother's room. The old woman lay propped against pillows, her breathing labored. The scar on her throat seemed more prominent than ever. She gestured for me to sit close. Her voice came out raspy, damaged by years of speaking through butchered vocal cords. She told me about her own cutting at age 12, how she'd fought and been held down by her own mother, how she'd spent weeks in agony as infection set in. Then she spoke about my sister, how she'd known the girl was suffering but said nothing, how she'd convinced herself it was necessary, that feminine virtue required sacrifice, how my sister's death had planted the first seed of doubt she'd ever felt. My grandmother pulled out a small box from under her pillow. Inside were photos I'd never seen, young women from decades past, all with scarred throats. Her sisters, her cousins, her friends. Some had died from complications, others had taken their own lives, all silenced in the name of tradition. She asked me to continue what I'd started, to save other girls from the fate that had stolen so many voices. Her hand gripped mine with surprising strength as she made me promise. Then she told me something that changed everything. The doctor wasn't just any practitioner, he was her nephew, trained by her own father decades ago. The cutting tradition in our community had been maintained by our bloodline for generations. My own family had been the guardians of this practice, profiting from the silence of others. This revelation reframed everything. My father's rage wasn't just about tradition, it was about protecting a family legacy built on mutilation. The exile wasn't just punishment, it was an attempt to silence the one voice that could expose the deeper truth. My grandmother gave me documents from the box, records of payments, names of girls who died, letters from families begging for exceptions that were never granted, evidence that the practice had always been about control, not virtue. I left through the back door as my mother kept watch. The weight of what I'd learned made my steps heavy. Catherine's mother noticed immediately when I got in the car. During the drive back, I shared everything. Her face went pale as the full scope became clear. We called an emergency meeting with our supporters. The documents changed everything. This wasn't just about ending a harmful tradition. It was about exposing generations of deliberate exploitation by my own family. The stakes had risen dramatically. Some families pulled back, frightened by the implications. Others became more determined. The evidence gave us leverage, but also painted targets on our backs. My father would do anything to protect the family secret. Over the following days, we carefully documented everything. Copies were made and distributed to trusted allies. Catherine's mother, who worked at a local clinic, verified the medical details in the records. The pattern of deaths and complications was undeniable. Sadie's situation grew desperate. Her parents had offered a reward for information about her whereabouts. Someone talked. She had to flee in the middle of the night as searchers surrounded the safe house. We barely got her out in time. The near capture rattled everyone. Some safe houses closed their doors. Others implemented stricter security measures. The underground network began to fracture under pressure. Girls who'd been hiding started to consider returning home. Then Catherine discovered something crucial while reviewing the documents. The tradition wasn't as old as claimed. It had only existed for 4 generations, started by my great-great-grandfather who'd been a traveling merchant. He'd brought it from another region where it was already dying out. This meant the practice could end with our generation. It wasn't an ancient custom, but a relatively recent import maintained by one family's greed and control. The revelation spread through our network, reinvigorating resistance efforts. My father must have sensed the shift. He called a community meeting at the largest hall in town. Attendance was mandatory for all traditional families. Armed with righteousness and generations of authority, he planned to reassert control. But we had plans too. Catherine and her tech-savvy friends had been busy. They'd created anonymous channels for cut girls to share their stories. They'd digitized all the documents. Everything was ready to release if the meeting went badly. The night before the meeting, I received another message, this time from my father directly. He wanted to negotiate. The message suggested he knew about my grandmother's betrayal. He proposed terms for ending the conflict. I could return home if I surrendered all evidence and publicly supported the tradition. I didn't respond. There was nothing to negotiate. Too many girls had suffered. Too many voices had been stolen. The truth needed to come out, regardless of personal cost. Catherine's family increased security around their house. The morning of the meeting arrived with palpable tension. Families walked to the hall in groups, divided by their stance on the tradition. Cut girls moved silently beside their husbands. Uncut girls clutched their mother's hands, knowing their fates hung in the balance. We watched from a distance as the hall filled. My father stood at the entrance, greeting arrivals with forced smiles. The doctor was there too, lurking in the shadows. They projected confidence, but I noticed the strain in their movements. Inside the hall, according to our allies who attended, my father spoke for an hour. He painted me as a corrupted child, influenced by outside ideas. He claimed the testimonies were exaggerated, that complications were rare. He called for unity against those who would destroy their way of life, but cracks showed immediately. When he called for questions, hands shot up. Parents wanted to know about the deaths mentioned in testimonies. They asked why the doctor used dirty tools. They questioned whether tradition justified risking their daughters' lives. My father struggled to maintain control. He dismissed concerns as hysteria. He threatened consequences for families that wavered, but his usual authority felt hollow. Too many people had heard their daughters' stories. Too many had seen the fear in young girls' eyes. Then someone played a recording on their phone. My grandmother's voice, weak but clear, confessing the family secret. The hall erupted. My father tried to speak over the chaos, but more phones appeared. The testimonies played from multiple sources, voices of girls filling the space. The doctor attempted to leave but found his path blocked. Parents who'd lost daughters to complications confronted him. Others demanded to know how much my family had profited from their children's suffering. The meeting dissolved into accusations and revelations. My father retreated from the stage as the crowd turned hostile. Traditional families found themselves outnumbered by those demanding change. The carefully maintained structure of generations began collapsing in real time. Unity shattered like glass. Outside, we monitored the situation through messages from allies inside. The confrontation grew heated but remained verbal. Some traditional families left in protest. Others stayed to argue their position. The community would never be the same. As the crowd finally dispersed, small groups formed on the street. Parents apologized to their cut daughters. Families scheduled for upcoming procedures announced cancellations. The doctor's car was found empty. He'd fled on foot when things turned. But victory felt incomplete. My father and his core supporters remained defiant. They retreated to our family home, planning their next move. The tradition might be dying, but its defenders wouldn't surrender easily. The real fight was just beginning. That night, Catherine's house filled with supporters celebrating the meeting's outcome. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only won a battle, not the war. My father had resources and connections. He'd regroup and strike back. My fears proved justified the next morning. Several families who'd spoken against the tradition found their businesses vandalized. Others received anonymous threats. My father's network was smaller but still dangerous. The community split into open conflict. Catherine and I decided to release everything online. The documents, testimonies, and evidence of my family's role in perpetuating the tradition. We created anonymous accounts and posted to forums where other communities practiced similar customs. The response was immediate. Messages poured in from girls in neighboring regions. They shared their own stories and asked for advice on resistance. Parents who'd been questioning the practice found courage in our community's rebellion. The movement spread beyond our borders. My father's response was swift and vicious. He filed complaints with local authorities about theft of family documents. He accused supporters of kidnapping for hiding runaway girls. He used every connection to make life difficult for families that opposed him. But for every action he took, more people joined our cause. The testimonies had given voice to generations of suppressed trauma. Mothers who'd been cut spoke to their daughters honestly for the first time. The silence that had protected the tradition became its greatest enemy. Sadie finally emerged from hiding when her parents announced they'd changed their minds about her procedure. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Other families followed suit, creating a cascade of cancellations that left the doctor without work. The financial pressure mounted on my father's business as boycotts expanded. Traditional families found themselves increasingly isolated. Some began to quietly question whether maintaining the practice was worth destroying their community. Cracks appeared in their unity. 3 months after my exile, I stood outside my former home again. This time, I wasn't alone. Dozens of girls and their families had gathered for a different kind of ceremony. We were there to witness the symbolic end of the cutting tradition. Catherine had suggested the gathering, not a protest, but a celebration of voices preserved. Cut girls would speak through sign language, while uncut girls sang songs that had been forbidden. It was a reclaiming of what had been stolen for generations. My father watched from his window as the crowd grew. He'd lost support even among his brothers. My uncles had daughters too, and the testimonies had made them reconsider. The family that had maintained the tradition for 4 generations was fracturing. As the sun set, candles were lit for girls who died from complications, for those who'd taken their own lives, for my sister, whose death had sparked my resistance. The flames flickered like the voices that had been silenced. Then something unexpected happened. My mother appeared at the front door. She walked through the crowd to where I stood, her face streaked with tears. In her hands was my grandmother's box of documents, and something else, a thick envelope. Inside were records going back even further. everywhere. Payment ledgers, names of families who'd tried to resist and been punished, evidence that the tradition had always been about profit and control, never about virtue or protection. My mother had spent months gathering it all. She spoke publicly for the first time about her own cutting, the infection that nearly unalived her, the years of pain when swallowing, the children she'd lost because she couldn't cry out during complicated births. Her voice, damaged but determined, carried across the gathering. One by one, other cut women stepped forward. They signed their stories while daughters translated. The gathering became a testimony to survival and resistance. Even some traditional families listened from their porches, unable to ignore the collective pain. As darkness fell, we dispersed peacefully. The symbolic ceremony had achieved something protests couldn't. It had shown that the community could unite around healing rather than tradition. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was finally visible. In the following weeks, more families abandoned the practice. The doctor never returned. His tools eventually burned in a bonfire attended by hundreds. My father's influence waned as his business failed and allies distanced themselves. Catherine's family helped me apply for educational programs in the city. Other exiled girls received similar support. We would leave not as outcasts, but as pioneers, carrying our stories to places where they could inspire further change. The night before I left, my father appeared at Catherine's door. He looked diminished, aged by the collapse of everything he'd built. He didn't apologize or ask for forgiveness. He simply handed me a letter and walked away. I opened it later, alone. Inside was the deed to my grandmother's house and a brief note. The family legacy was mine to reshape or destroy. He was leaving town, unable to bear the shame of his failure. The guardian of tradition had been defeated by the voices he'd tried to silence. As my bus pulled away from the only home I'd known, I thought about my sister. Her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The tradition that had unalived her was dying too. Other communities were questioning their practices. The ripples of resistance spread further each day. Catherine waved from the platform, already planning the next phase of our movement. We had contacts in 3 neighboring regions where similar traditions existed. The testimonies would travel. The resistance would grow. No more girls would be silenced. The cutting tradition had thrived in darkness and silence. But we'd learned that voices, once raised together, were impossible to stop. My exile had become my liberation. My family's legacy of harm would end with me. As the familiar landscape faded behind me, I touched my throat, intact, whole, ready to speak for those who couldn't. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in generations, girls in my community could face their futures with voices preserved. The bus station parking lot was empty when Catherine's mother dropped me off. She pressed extra money into my hand despite my protests, then drove away quickly. I stood there with my single bag, watching other passengers arrive for the morning departure. My phone buzzed with messages from girls in the network. 3 more had gone into hiding overnight. Their parents had moved up cutting dates after hearing about the gathering. I typed quick responses, connecting them with safe houses, but my attention kept drifting to movement across the street. A familiar car sat parked near the corner, my uncle's. He'd been watching the bus station, probably on my father's orders. I ducked behind a pillar and waited. 20 minutes passed before he finally drove away, likely assuming I'd already left. The bus arrived late. I found a seat near the back and settled in for the 6-hour journey to the city. Other passengers chatted around me while I reviewed apartment listings Catherine had sent. Most were beyond my budget, even with the money from selling my grandmother's jewelry. Halfway through the trip, we stopped at a roadside station. I stepped out to stretch and immediately spotted another familiar face, my cousin Marcus, one of my father's most loyal supporters. He stood by the vending machines, pretending to make a selection while watching me. I walked calmly to the restroom and locked myself in a stall. My hands shook as I texted Catherine. She responded immediately with a plan. Her friend lived in the next town over and could pick me up if I got off early. Back on the bus, I kept my head down and watched Marcus through the window. He was on his phone, probably reporting my location. When we reached the next stop, I grabbed my bag and slipped off with a group of other passengers. Catherine's friend waited in a hit-up sedan. We drove back roads for an hour before she dropped me at a different bus station. This time, I bought a ticket to a completely different city, doubling back on my planned route. The second bus was nearly empty. I dozed fitfully, waking each time we stopped to scan for familiar faces. By evening, I'd reached the city limits. The skyline looked impossibly large after a lifetime in our small community. The address Catherine had given me led to a rundown building near the university district. The landlady, a friend of Catherine's aunt, showed me a tiny studio apartment, peeling paint, water stains on the ceiling, but it had a working lock and was far from anyone who knew my name. I paid 2 weeks up front and collapsed on the thin mattress. Messages continued flooding my phone. The network was growing. Girls from communities I'd never heard of were reaching out, sharing their own stories of resistance. The next morning brought new challenges. The educational program Catherine had mentioned required documentation I didn't have. My father had kept all important papers locked away. Without transcripts or identification beyond my basic ID, enrollment seemed impossible. I spent hours at the program office explaining my situation to increasingly sympathetic staff. They'd never encountered someone fleeing forced vocal cord cutting, but they recognized desperation. A counselor made calls, pulled strings, found loopholes in admission requirements. While waiting for approval, I found work at a restaurant near campus. The manager didn't ask questions about my lack of references. I washed dishes for 10 hours straight, my hands raw from industrial soap, grateful for the mindless labor that kept darker thoughts at bay. 2 weeks passed in this routine. Work, sleep, check messages from the network, repeat. Catherine visited once, bringing news from home. More families had abandoned the tradition. My father's business had closed. The doctor hadn't been seen in months, but there were setbacks too. 3 girls had been forcibly cut after their hiding places were discovered. 1 developed severe complications. Her parents, who'd supported the tradition, now faced their daughter's permanent disability. The irony was bitter. My phone rang during a shift. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. My mother's voice came through, barely audible over the kitchen noise. She spoke quickly, urgently. My father had left town, destination unknown. She wanted to send my documents. I gave her the restaurant's address, not trusting her with my apartment location. The package arrived 3 days later. Birth certificate, school records, medical files, everything I needed for the program, plus something unexpected. Photos of my sister I'd never seen. The educational program accepted me for the spring semester. Basic courses to complete my interrupted schooling, then vocational training. The counselor helped me apply for financial aid, warning that it would only cover tuition. Living expenses remained my problem. I picked up extra shifts, sometimes working 16-hour days. My body ached constantly, but each paycheck meant another month of rent secured. Other exiled girls reached out, some considering similar escapes. I shared what I'd learned about survival in the city. Catherine called with disturbing news. My father had been spotted in a neighboring community where the cutting tradition was stronger. He was meeting with their leaders, possibly trying to establish himself there. The man who'd lost everything still clung to his beliefs. A month into city life, I encountered unexpected resistance. The restaurant owner's wife discovered my background through community gossip that had somehow traveled here. She demanded her husband fire me, claiming I brought shame to their establishment. He refused, but the atmosphere grew tense. Other workers whispered when I passed. Someone left anonymous notes in my locker, suggesting I'd polluted myself to avoid tradition. I kept working, needing the money too desperately to quit. The network continued expanding. We'd created a simple website with resources for girls seeking escape, safe house locations, transportation help, job listings in distant cities. Traffic grew daily as word spread through hidden channels. My studies began amid this chaos. Sitting in classrooms with students who'd never feared for their voices felt surreal. They complained about homework while I treasured each assignment. Education meant possibilities beyond dishwashing and hiding. 3 months after arriving, I received an unexpected visitor. Sadie appeared at my apartment door, eyes red from crying. Her parents had tried to force her into cutting after all. She'd escaped through a bathroom window, hitchhiked to the city with only the clothes on her back. I gave her my bed and slept on the floor. The next morning, we went through the same process I'd navigated. Restaurant job, program enrollment, finding resources. The cycle repeated as more girls followed the path we'd carved. My father surfaced again through network reports. He'd established himself in that traditional community, becoming their unofficial spokesman for preserving the cutting. His speeches grew more extreme, calling resistors diseased and corrupted. Even some supporters found his rhetoric uncomfortable. The restaurant job ended when the owner's wife finally won. I found work at a factory, then a cleaning service. Each job paid less than the last as word spread through informal networks, but I kept working, kept studying, kept responding to messages from desperate girls. 6 months after exile, Catherine arrived for an extended visit. She brought photos from home. The cutting hut had been demolished, its grounds turned into a memorial garden. My mother had been instrumental in the project, finally finding her voice after years of silence. We spent the evening updating the network website. New communities were joining the resistance. Some had abandoned the cutting entirely. Others modified it to symbolic ceremonies with no actual harm. Progress came slowly, but it came. My first semester grades arrived. Straight A's despite everything. The counselor suggested I consider university after completing the program. The idea seemed impossibly ambitious, but I'd learned to embrace impossible things. Sadie had found her footing too. She worked at a bookstore near campus, sharing an apartment with 2 other exiled girls. They'd created their own chosen family, supporting each other through nightmares and celebrations alike. The network grew beyond our ability to manage alone. Catherine recruited tech-savvy friends to help maintain the website. Former cut girls who'd found their voices through sign language created video testimonies. The movement had momentum we'd never imagined. My father's activities grew increasingly concerning. He'd convinced several communities to accelerate cutting schedules. Girls as young as 11 were being subjected to the procedure. Even traditional families began questioning his influence. I focused on what I could control: studies, work, helping new arrivals adjust to city life. Each girl who escaped was a victory. Each family that reconsidered was progress. The work was exhausting but necessary. Winter brought new challenges. Heating bills strained already tight budgets. Several girls in the network faced homelessness when they couldn't make rent. We scrambled to find solutions, cramming extra people into tiny apartments, sharing resources. An unexpected ally emerged. A professor at the university had heard about our network. Her grandmother had been cut in another country decades ago. She offered meeting space, research resources, connections to refugee support organizations. Through her, we accessed legal aid for girls seeking official documentation. Many had fled without proper papers. Lawyers volunteered time to help establish identities, secure work permits, navigate bureaucracies that seemed designed to exclude us. My second semester began with cautious optimism. The vocational program placed me in an internship at a medical clinic, real experience that could lead to actual career prospects. I worked there mornings, attended classes afternoons, and cleaned offices at night. Catherine reported major developments from home. The community had officially banned the cutting practice. My father's supporters had dwindled to a handful of extremists. Even my mother had publicly denounced the tradition, sharing her story at community gatherings. But victory wasn't universal. Other communities clung to the practice. Girls still disappeared from schools, returning voiceless. The network received desperate messages daily. We saved who we could, mourned those we couldn't reach. My father made one last attempt at relevance. He published a manifesto defending the cutting tradition, filled with conspiracy theories about outside corruption. Most dismissed it as the ravings of a bitter man, but it found audience among extremists. I ignored his words, focusing on final exams. The internship had offered me part-time employment after graduation. Not much, but enough to leave the cleaning job. Each step forward felt monumental after starting with nothing. Sadie graduated from her program first. She'd studied early childhood education, determined to teach young girls their voices mattered. Her job placement was in another city, but we celebrated before she left. Another success story for the network. The website traffic had grown exponentially. Girls from countries we'd never heard of reached out. The cutting tradition existed in various forms worldwide. Our small resistance had connected to something larger. Change was possible. My graduation day arrived with little fanfare. Catherine and her mother attended, along with several girls from the network. We gathered at my tiny apartment afterward, sharing cheap food and cheaper wine. Survivors celebrating survival. The medical clinic job provided stability I'd never known. Regular hours, decent pay, health insurance. I moved to a better apartment, one without water stains and broken locks. Small luxuries that felt like miracles. More girls arrived monthly, following the path we'd established. The network had grown into an informal underground railroad. Safe houses, transportation networks, job connections, educational opportunities. We'd built what we'd needed to survive. My father faded into irrelevance. Reports placed him in increasingly remote communities, preaching to dwindling audiences. The tradition he'd unalived for was dying. Not fast enough, but dying nonetheless. His legacy was its destruction. 2 years after exile, I stood before a classroom of nursing students. The professor had invited me to speak about cultural medical practices. I touched my throat, still whole, and began sharing my story. Their faces showed the same horror I'd once felt. After the lecture, several students approached with questions. One revealed her own community practiced female circumcision. Another spoke of foot binding in her grandmother's grandmother's generation. The cutting of voices was just one tradition among many that needed to end. The network had evolved into a formal organization. Catherine ran it full-time, funded by small donations and grants. We'd helped over 300 girls escape various harmful traditions, each success built on previous ones. My mother visited for my birthday. We met at a neutral restaurant, still rebuilding trust. She brought photos of the memorial garden where the cutting hut once stood. Flowers grew where blood had soaked the ground. Beauty from horror. She revealed that my father had tried contacting her. He was sick, possibly dying, wanting forgiveness. She'd refused to tell him my location. The man who'd tried to steal my voice would die never hearing it again. Justice came in many forms. I returned to my apartment that night feeling oddly empty. The urgency of survival had given way to something harder to define. Purpose beyond mere existence. The network provided that, but I wanted more. Maybe university wasn't so impossible. Catherine called with news. A documentary filmmaker wanted to feature our story. We declined immediately. The work continued best in shadows. Too much attention would drive the practice deeper underground, making girls harder to help. Instead, we focused on expanding support services, job training programs, counseling resources, educational scholarships, moving beyond emergency response to long-term empowerment. Each girl who built a new life proved the tradition's lies about feminine worth. My nursing degree acceptance letter arrived on the anniversary of my exile. 3 years of prerequisite courses while working full-time had paid off. The girl who'd fled with nothing would become a medical professional. My sister would have been proud. The network thrived without my constant involvement. New leaders emerged, bringing fresh ideas and energy. The movement had grown beyond any individual story. Collective voices proved more powerful than any tradition's attempts to silence them. I packed my life into boxes again, preparing for university, this time by choice, not desperation. The apartment that had been refuge became just a place I'd lived. Growth meant leaving safety behind, but I'd learned to embrace uncertainty. My last shift at the clinic ended with unexpected tears. Colleagues who'd become friends gathered to wish me well. They'd hired another network girl to replace me. The cycle of support continued, each success enabling the next. Catherine drove me to university housing. We sat in her car, remembering that first terrifying ride away from everything we'd known. The scared girl in the stained dress had become someone neither of us could have imagined. She handed me a gift before leaving. Inside was a photo album documenting the network's growth. Hundreds of faces, all girls who'd kept their voices. My story had become their story, woven into something larger than any individual thread. That night in my dorm room, I opened my anatomy textbook. The chapter on vocal cords made me pause. Such small, delicate structures that meant everything. I traced the diagrams, grateful for the voice I'd fought to keep. My phone buzzed with a message from a new girl seeking help. I forwarded it to the network, trusting others to guide her as I'd been guided. The work continued whether I was there or not. Systems we'd built from desperation had become institutions of hope. I thought of my father, alone with his bitter beliefs. My mother, finding redemption in garden soil. My sister, whose death had sparked everything. The tradition that had defined generations was ending, one saved voice at a time. Outside my window, other students laughed and talked freely. They'd never known the fear of forced silence. I envied their innocence while being grateful for my scars. Survival had taught me things no classroom could. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Anatomy lectures, clinical rotations, building a life beyond mere escape. But tonight, I simply existed in the space between what was and what could be. A girl with a voice, preparing to heal others. The cutting tradition would persist in pockets, defended by men like my father who confused control with virtue. But for every girl silenced, more would resist. The network would catch them, guide them, help them build lives of their own choosing. I closed my textbook and prepared for bed. In the morning, I'd begin the next phase of an impossible journey, from voiceless victim to healer of bodies. My grandmother's legacy of harm transformed into one of healing. The work was far from over. It might never truly end, but each preserved voice sang a song of resistance that no tradition could silence. We'd proven that together, whispers could become roars, and I would keep roaring, for myself and for those still finding their voices.